the dark clouds push my head down, I fade away. Talk down all my aspirations, trying to find my babe. Love yourself and find your soulmate. The elders say that may, but still my will to build a new day fills a world away. Crave daily nightlife, me crazy might like body type, but not quite. 2020 hindsight, blinded by the lust, going for bust, might trust, might hide up in the spotlight. Eyes closed, daylight. Sunshine, sunshine. I'm feeling your sunshine, sunshine. You like a star born, hit the sunspot deep in my carbon. With photon radiation to my heart storm. Love like you never heard before. Leave the light on, sitting in positions like yoga, moving through solar system. My beloved is reflected in the spectrum of the prism. Your rhythm is fatal. You too sexy for your halo, but you can rock an ashen ray belt. Sun kiss. Sunshine, sunshine. I'm feeling the sunshine, sunshine.
My name is Nicole Vulcan. I'm the editor of The Source Weekly, and I co-founded the Love Your Neighbor project with Erika McCalpine, the moderator of tonight's event back in February. To frame tonight's event, we wanted to look back at some of the events and yes, even progress that this community has made over the past year. And we did it by way of headlines. There were just about 30 slides in that presentation you just saw, and that smattering of headlines only scratched the surface of what's happened just right here in Central Oregon over the past year. It's astounding what collective action can do. So I'm here like you to listen tonight, and in keeping with the spirit of my profession, to bear witness to the forward momentum our community has shown. I also believe in its potential for even more. With that, I'd like to introduce you tonight to Erika McCalpine. She's the Business Program Director and Instructor, as well as the Director of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Laboratory at Oregon State University Cascades. She was also named The Source Weekly's Woman of the Year in 2019, and she's the moderator of tonight's event titled Bringing Healing to Communities of Color Post-Election. Thank you, Erika, for the effort and devotion you do to this work. Val, you raised an amazing woman. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. That was super sweet. Thank you. So the reason that this event is so very important to me is because for hundreds of years, Black people have been pitted against each other. It started during slavery, when light-skinned slaves were given the duties in their master's home, while the darker-skinned slaves were given outside duties. Resentment developed because one group thought the other group had it easier than they did. Neither group realized that no matter the chore or the job that they were given to do, they were all still enslaved people. It was a tactic used to divide them so that they wouldn't unify or support each other. Their master maintained control through division. Today, this same resentment shows itself, but for very different reasons. Things like education, perceived wealth, or societal standing are what divide us. There is a need to discuss calling people out, cancel culture, and online bullying, because it is something that is attempted frequently in our community. It is happening within communities of color, and some of us that are participating on this panel tonight have experienced it. We are here to talk about the phenomenon of cancel culture and the effects of it. We are here to share our own experiences and the way those actions impact us. We're also here to talk about how we can move forward in a way which we help each other and not harm each other, where we are united and not divided. I want to publicly thank groups like the Central Oregon Peacekeepers, the Central Oregon Diversity Project, the Central Oregon Black Leaders Assembly, the Fathers Group, Indivisible Band, and the many other organizations that are led by people of color in this community. We need all of your voices. I also want to thank the many allies that we have, because without you marching alongside people of color, voting to support causes that are important to people of color, and financially supporting our efforts, we wouldn't have accomplished as much as we have to date. I want to encourage you to open your heart and listen to the words that are spoken here tonight. This event is an attempt to bring us together, not widen the divide that is present among us. We would like to start tonight by hearing from Dr. Dwaine Plaza. Dwaine is a professor of sociology on the main campus of Oregon State University. During his 23 years at Oregon State, he has written numerous journal articles and book chapters. Dwaine is the perfect person to provide his insight on cancel culture, as one of his areas of expertise is race and ethnic relations. Not only is Dwaine esteemed faculty, he is a friend and a mentor, and I'm honored to introduce you, Dwaine.
Thank you very much, Erika. I really appreciate your kind introduction. And welcome to everybody who is sharing their time with us tonight. I'm always thankful for that, especially in the Zoom culture that we're in. And I want to encourage you to engage with the presentation I'm about to give, and also, of course, to engage later on with the individuals who are going to be forming the panel to talk about this from a more personal perspective. And so I titled this presentation, Cancel Culture and Its Impact on Individuals and Communities in Central Oregon. And so the whole notion of cancel culture, theoretically for many of us, is sort of a new issue. Many of us have never heard that word before, but I think that's a word, and I'll make the case to you tonight, that this notion of canceling people out is not new. It's actually historically quite prevalent. It's just that we have new technology today to actually do it in a much more efficient way. So to give you an idea of what I'm going to present tonight, I'm going to start off by talking to you about how cancel culture is linked to sociology and media studies theories. I'm going to provide you some examples of practices of where people have been canceled as individuals and organizations. I'm going to also bring in some different views on cancel culture from the previous president and the current president of the United States. I'm going to also try to overview for you very quickly sort of the rise of social media, because I think part of the cancel culture which we are very much experiencing today has been brought to us really by this really huge, very rapid rise in media culture that we're now immersed within. And I'm going to present you a case study example where cancel culture has been used to change the understanding and the focus of the issue itself. And then finally, we can have a quick discussion on the effects of cancel culture on individuals and communities in Central Oregon. And then I would like us to work together to strategize ways to move forward in Central Oregon in an effort to better understand the cancel culture environment and how it now swirls as the defunct President Trump government goes out. So let's begin by sort of understanding what is cancel culture. And so the term itself refers to the cultural phenomena of canceling someone after they publicly disgrace themselves in some way. It can be something really insignificant or a major indiscretion. After this person makes this error in judgment, everyone effectively cancels them by unfollowing them, shaming them publicly, destroying their products, and effectively ruining their careers. And so the cancel culture phenomenon then is one that brands, even television shows, movies, have now been considered offensive or problematic for some particular reason. And I've given you a couple of just examples for you to think about in the current period. And that could be the issue of the Confederate soldiers statues, or the Confederate statues, issues around food products, which are still in our grocery stores, Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, cream of wheat, those sort of things. And I want you to start thinking a little bit about how we have in the last probably year or so moved towards canceling these cultural icons. I want to quote now Jill McCorkle, a professor of sociology at Villanova University. She notes that the roots of cancel culture have been present throughout human history. Societies have punished people for behaving outside of perceived social norms by isolating them, ridiculing them, torturing them. The church has certainly excommunicated them. We have certainly banished them from their positions within the majority groups. This, as you can kind of imagine, is quite harmful to the human psyche, because as human beings, we desire to be accepted. We desire to belong, and we desire to matter within groups. And so the culture, the canceling culture then is just another version of that today. And so cancel culture then is a sort of a modern form of ostracism. Basically, the call out constitutes a form of a boycotting of an individual who is deemed to have acted or spoken in a questionable or controversial manner. And again, I want to just sort of quote some more experts on this topic. Professor Lisa Nakamura from the University of Michigan, media studies professor, suggests to us that canceling someone is a form of a cultural boycott, and that cancel culture is the ultimate expression of our agency, which is born of a desire for control, as people have limited power over what is presented to them on social media, and a need for sort of accountability that's not really centralized. And to quote one last professor, Keith Hampton, another professor of media studies, but this time at Michigan State University, he suggests to us that the practice of cancel culture contributes to the polarization of American society. But it really doesn't lead necessarily to changes in public opinion. And so here we see again some images of some very interesting cultural icons that include Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It includes Ellen DeGeneres. It includes Dave Chappelle and others who you may know their stories, and I'm not going to go into their stories now about why they became canceled very recently, but you can certainly look those up online, and there's a whole narrative so you can actually sort of follow attempts to cancel out these individuals and their careers because of them saying something controversial or not with the liking of a certain group of people. And so the last two people I want to have you sort of understand their version of cancel culture are two major opinion leaders. My most favorite opinion leader at the top, very top, President Barack Obama, really warns us against social media calling out culture, saying, quote, people who do really good stuff have flaws. In other words, all of us have flaws. And so people who are fighting may love their children. People who you're fighting may love their children and they certainly share things with you. In other words, he's saying that these people certainly may have made a mistake, but we can't identify them only for that kernel of a mistake. And we need to sort of see the holistic person rather than just for the mistake. And more recently, again, the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, has criticized cancel culture in his speech in the July 2020 national campaign where he was nomination campaign. He compared cancel culture to totalitarianism. And he claimed that it's a political weapon used to punish and shame dissenters by driving them from their jobs and demanding submission. So now I want to take you on a journey now to sort of understand why cancel culture itself could be possible in the 2020 period. And to do that, we really have to look at the rise of digital media and social media. And as we look at these numbers here in most recent ones I could find in 2020, we'd note here that the total population of the world is 7.75 billion people. And of those 7.75 billion people, 5.19 billion of those folks actually have access to a mobile device. And more than half of the world population now has access to the internet. And about a third of those set of folks actually are active social media users. So this is a serious issue is what I'm getting at. I'm using these statistics to tell you a little bit about the seriousness by which we need to sort of realize that social media has now become a cultural phenomenon in our society today. And as we look at people's use of social media, we realize, of course, that the world average in terms of people online is about 3 hours and 40 minutes. Here in the United States, however, we are about 2 hours and 3 minutes in terms of our daily use of social media sources. So to me, that's a large amount of our time being spent in the world of social media. Well, what kind of social media are we on? Well, clearly Facebook is dominant here, and also YouTube and WhatsApp. These are three social media platforms that we are using, and we're using to a great extent. And interestingly enough, when we look at those more statistics, we find that although we're using social media, the United States ranks higher than the average in terms of concern about what we often refer to as fake news. So here we clearly have about 67% of Americans report that they're really worried about this notion of fake news appearing in their social media feed. And what I find interesting about this chart is if you look at the very bottom end of it, it has the Netherlands. They seem to only have a little over 30% of them concerned. And at the top end, you have Brazilians who are 85% concerned about fake news. That's kind of interesting. All right, so now let's go on to sort of talk about a case study. This is the case study I want to talk about because I think it's one that really helps us to sort of understand how you can actually use a version of cancel culture in order to change the way in which a movement actually has sympathy or support to it. And I refer now to the movement of the social movement of Black Lives Matter. And here's a case that the movement itself has been around for probably now almost 10 years. As it stands now, with the killing of Trayvon Martin, it's sort of the genesis of it. But I want you to think about this going back historically, back into the 1900s, because when African-American folks left the South and started moving north, they certainly had a situation where they moved into large major metropolises like New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago. They came directly in confrontations with Europeans that were living in those cities and European police officers. And so for one of the very first times, African Americans found themselves as minorities, because in many southern states, they were actually part of majorities, ironically. They moved into these and they became minorities, often pushed into ghettoized communities. And in those communities, they often found themselves at loggerheads with the police right away. The police would enforce extra policing on black folks who were migrating from the south to north. And that extra policing really then becomes a situation where Black lives are being lost at the hands of police. So it's not a new phenomenon. I want to emphasize that to you. Now, as we move into the current period, however, it's very easy to use cancel culture ideas to actually diminish the issue that Black Lives Matter movement actually wants us to understand. And that is that they want us to better understand that Black lives have always been at risk. And so by inserting into the public narrative the idea of all lives mattering or blue lives matter, that takes away from the whole reality that Black folks have been at the hands of police experiencing systemic, structural, and individual racism for decades. Again, coming back to the turn of the century when African Americans were moving into the cities. And so when we do that, when we change the narrative and we allow, through social media in particular, this notion of blue lives mattering, all lives mattering, I like to think about it almost with the idea of when you go to a doctor and you have, let's say, an ailment in your lower abdomen, and the doctor diagnoses you for having, let's say, colon cancer. And then the doctor then decides, well, you know what? The colon cancer isn't that important. I'm going to treat you for brain cancer instead. So I want you to think about that. if you have an ailment somewhere and you're not really treating it, and you're treating somewhere else, then you all of a sudden negated the fact that your ailment, which is the one that's probably going to cause you the most harm, which is the colon cancer, is actually not as important. And so I want you to think about that analogy in the same way that our society has decided that it's not really about Black Lives Mattering, it's about all lives mattering. And the reality is, no, we need to focus our emphasis and our concern on that group that has actually had faced for centuries, 300 years in the United States, and more so in the last 100 or so years when African Americans started moving into cities in the South, from the South to the North, that we need to address the issues of Black people finding themselves being murdered and killed by the police and being treated horrendously. So I want to think about that even more swirled up in the last year or so. And I say that in the last year or so, and primarily because of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. This becomes, again, issues that have rebubbled up to the surface, and we now have to deal with those as a society. So what are the effects then of having this cancel culture on individuals and communities in Central Oregon? Well, in Central Oregon, you have a history of African American people being the last group to actually get into Central Oregon and Oregon in general, right? We have lots of institutionalized laws in Oregon that restricted African American people from ever coming here. That included, it was in the Constitution up until 2002. We certainly then have a whole history, as was mentioned at the very front end by Erika, the whole idea of dividing and ruling Black people. And dividing and ruling could be by color. We now have dividing and ruling Black folks by class. We now have, of course, dividing and ruling Black folks by ideology, right? Political perspective. And so these divisions within the African American population are expected in some respects, but at the same time, they're exacerbated because other folks use those as a way of keeping people more divided than they are collectively conscious. And I say collectively conscious because at the end of the day, people read your body. As W.E.B. Du Bois says, when you come into a room, people read you like a text. They look at your hair texture, they look at your skin color, they look at your eye shape, they look at how tall or how short you are, and they put you then into a category of being male or female to begin with. And then they then assess your race. And in the United States, race is one of the most important social constructed categories, primarily because it's the foundation of the United States. It's the way in which the United States became a country. It was founded on the genocide of the Native American people, followed by the slavery period where African Americans' bodies were used as the main means of economic production for the society for, as I said, almost 300 years. And so within that cabal of issues going on with divide and rule and slavery, you then have in the post-slavery period, a period of which African American people also find themselves in this disarray, divided by color, divided by class, divided by education, amount of education some have and some don't have. And you have within that group then, I always like to think about it as something called horizontal hostility. And that's the term that we use in sociology to describe individuals who are oppressed, who then start infighting with each other. And here's an analogy that I always use for my students. And the analogy is, think about a bucket with crabs that you've put inside the bucket. Now what you find, of course, is if you have the top of the bucket open, the crabs will inevitably try to escape from the bucket. And what will they do? They will, of course, pull each other down in an attempt to seek freedom, because they realize that nothing good can happen in that bucket if they're all stuck in there, because they realize that they may be, again, succumbing to someone's plot, right? Within all of this then, in Central Oregon and the rest of Oregon itself, Black folks and people of color in general are oftentimes finding themselves in the midst of, we often refer to as polite racism. And polite racism is that situation where people are very polite with you. They are upfront with you in the sense that they act as if, you know, they don't have a racist bone in their body. We've heard that before, right? I'm sure. And the reality is that your race becomes more important to them than your character. And so the polite racism becomes small microaggressions that are oftentimes perpetrated against you that you don't you don't particularly want to accept, but they're actually happening. It could be being overlooked for a job position. It could be treated unfairly by the police. It could be lots of different ways in which you're treated unfairly by authority figures. In the DMV office, going in to have your children educated in the school system, et cetera, et cetera. And in my own university and in other universities and other institutions, we also have, of course, have token representation of people of color in general, and of course, African-American people more specifically. And this token representation is oftentimes, I like to view it through the lens of a microscope. Although you're there as the person who's in charge or the leader, you're oftentimes, your first or second mistake you make gets magnified to the extent that you now start coming to represent your entire race of people as opposed to your individual situations that have taken place. And so in the context of Central Oregon or Oregon itself, we clearly have situations where people of color in general, and Black folks more particularly, and people from the LGBTQ community, or the intersection of all of those, find themselves very much isolated, very much living in a situation where they oftentimes have to wear a mask, very much living in a situation sometimes where they have to have a front stage persona versus a backstage persona in their conducting of their affairs. As a result of this, these particular individuals are oftentimes the victims of systemic trauma or generational trauma. That is, the trauma is passed on from parents to children because of the kinds of treatment the parents are getting, and it's systemic, the trauma itself. It's a kind of a feeling whereby you're constantly feeling that until you get to your home and shut your door and lock your door and hide behind your own door, you are always under a stream of feeling like you are an outsider. And then finally, living in a culture where your colleagues have white fragility. And that is, when I say white fragility, it's a term that's coined way before myself. Robin DiAngelo's book I might want to recommend to folks on this call who are interested in reading up more about this, what fragility of white folks is all about. She really puts it in very easy to read language, where she's talking about how fragile white folks are, especially when confronted with their own white privilege. And so white privilege really is that privilege of knowing that you don't have to ever feel like you don't belong in a place. You are the default. You are the individuals who don't have to ever explain yourself. People don't come up and ask you awkward questions about, when did you move here? How long have you lived here? Are you sure you're a citizen? Are you sure you, you have those credentials, et cetera, et cetera. And so as we move forward then, this is sort of my last slide here in terms of sort of understanding how do we counter some of these effects of this counterculture that's actually taken us with this notion of individuals in our communities in Central Oregon or in Oregon itself. And so what I'm left thinking about as an individual who is spent 23 years living in Oregon and now spent 4 years under the legacy of Donald Trump is that I'm sort of worried about the swirl. I'm really worried about the divide and rule policies and the actions that he has taken intentionally to create us as a divided set of people. And moving forward then, I'm going to sort of leave us with some thoughts here, some questions to think about. And for me, when I saw the election results and they're overwhelmingly, we're about to change the president. But the point is, how do we heal? How do we find social justice in a situation where an election result showed us that 73 million Americans versus 80 million Americans decided to vote for a swirl and a divided and rule policy in the United States? They wanted that to continue. And yet 80 million of us said no. I'm of course siding with the 80 million and saying, I really want the 80 million to be people that are surrounding me and very close to me. I do not want to be around the 73 million people until we all have a chance to sort of come together and dialogue across various intersectionalities of our identities. And I want you to think about what structural changes need to take place in Bend or in Central Oregon or in the institutions that we occupy to create those communities of dialogue, communities of change. And finally, would we consider regulating our social media and its long-term social, cultural, and psychological effects? Because clearly our social media has contributed now to some of these divide and rules, the swirl that's going on, the ways in which we're looking at our fellow human being and the ways in which we are making judgments about people based on a single story. I always like to think about the notion of a single story that we have about people, which is then a notion, which is then a sort of code word for a stereotype or a trope that we have about people that oftentimes don't allow us to have those deeper, meaningful conversations. And so tonight, as we move into our next set of conversations and dialogues with our colleagues here who've been invited to talk about the ways in which they feel a sense of feeling alienated in Bend, or feeling a sense that they are the victims, and always having to try to deal with the trauma that they work through every day, getting out their door and trying to be a member of society and so forth. Let's really listen to each other, and let's really try to learn, and let's also contribute some of your stories. So on that note, I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to turn it back over to Erika to facilitate the next part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dwaine, for that very informative presentation and for sharing your thoughts with us on cancel culture and social media use. We really appreciate that. I want to introduce the rest of the panel to you all. We have some familiar to Love Your Neighbor faces and some that are new. So we have Joanne Mina, a local activist and volunteer coordinator with the Latino Community Association. And Joanne has been in this community for over 10 years. Judith Sadora, a wilderness therapist with Evoke therapy programs at Cascades, who works with adolescent boys of color. Jessica Amascual, a local poet and community builder. And Rita Schenkelberg, a mental health counselor and a Bend City Councilor-elect. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I want to ask you first, what's your hope for our community after this event? And I will start with you, Judith.
Oh, put me on the spot. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here this evening with you guys. My hope, as I was kind of just listening to the presentation and watching it, it was interesting because a lot of things came up for me, but I think in general, my biggest hope is when we talk about healing within our communities, because it's titled, right? Healing within a BIPOC community. When we're thinking about that, I think my hope is for us to really have a conversation of what that actually means, especially as it relates to trauma, and especially as it relates to just our history and how we show up in this work together as a community. We're very diverse. We're talking about, it's so interesting. We're talking about diversity. Diversity means a multiple number of people with different experiences, different belief systems, different ways of doing something. And I like to believe and to think that it's for a common goal in some ways, but it's being approached differently. And so, yeah, I think that's my biggest goal is really to define, whether it's multiple definitions or whatever it is, but to really understand and unpack in a conversation of what healing actually looks like as we do this work towards reconciliation, toward liberation, towards all the things together as a community within the BIPOC community.
Thank you so much. And one thing I failed to do, Nathan Moses, our event manager, is here, and he needs to give instructions to the audience on how to ask us questions. So before we jump into everyone else asking that same question, I'm going to allow Nathan an opportunity to give some instruction. Sorry, Nathan.
No. This is all good, and this is the environment that is our digital event. So no worries. I love this. Those of you that have attended virtual events put on by OSU-Cascades before, we utilize a application called Mentimeter. So those of you that are logged in via YouTube, you can shoot questions throughout the entire presentation through YouTube if you're logged in. Those of you that don't have a YouTube account, all you need to do is go to menti.com. That's menti.com. This will be posted on the screen in a little bit, but you're going to use the code 4617250. That's 17250, and it's going to allow our participants to ask a question to the panelists. So please be as directed if it's a specific question that you have of one of the panelists. If it's more general, feel free to put whatever you need to in there and we'll cover them as we go.
Thank
you very
you.
much.
Okay, so back to the question of what is your hope for our community after this event? Jessica.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here with you all. And thank you, Erika and OSU and all the people that allowed us to be in conversation about what it means to, or what it can mean to heal for BIPOC in this time. And I guess my hope is that we can create a safe space together here, like from here on out as a community, to talk about community healing and center healing as like an integral piece of the liberation movement for everyone. And I think often we are in this state of urgency. We're in this state of like fighting for resources, fighting for this and fighting for that, like our way is the way. And without realizing that really all together, we could build so much capacity and we could like really build the movement. And so just wanting to uplift what Erika and Judith both said about, you know, heading the same direction basically, but doing it in a diverse way. And there's this quote, I read it in Emergent Strategy from Adrienne Marine Brown, but it's originally, I think, from Loretta Ross. And it's like something, I'm then paraphrasing, but something like, you know, people moving in this, thinking the same thing and moving the same direction is a cult, but people thinking different things and moving in the same direction, that's a movement. And so how can we create space to honor all of our different ways of contributing to the liberation movement, all of our different ways of contributing in diverse ways. And so that's what my hope is, that this is a starting point of dialogue in our community amongst BIPOC organizers to really to consider what it might look like to move healing more central to the conversation of liberation and activism and advocacy and moving resources together to uplift all of us.
Thank you. Joanne?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to join in conversation. You know, I hope is that no one among us is considered vulnerable anymore. And why vulnerable? Because many times I find myself with identities that people will consider, oh, you're a vulnerable community member, right? And what does that mean? That means that we live in a world and in a society that does not have a safety net to protect me and care for me. And so my hope is that we can really engage on a dialogue of finding out what does healing for individuals and for us together as community looks like. What does it take for us to center voices of those that are having negative impacts and do it in a way that we come together rather than having experiences or relationships that puts us against each other, right? So my hope, yeah, it's healing that serves all of us and that ultimately has tangible results in which we have transformed our community to be a place that cares for all.
Thank you. That was inspiring. Thank you. Rita.
Wow, that was amazing. I can't believe I have to follow all of those amazing humans. Thank you for having me on this panel, and hi everyone. My hope really is kind of interwoven between like the world of being a city councilor-elect, but also being a mental health therapist. So like from a structural point, my hope is that we begin to create structures that actually serve the community that lives here in Bend. I I've spent so much time over the last few months seeing how structures and humans that are part of those structures really bring the entire community down. And I think that's something that is often kind of feels really, really big, but also I feel when we're having conversations like this, we can talk about the structures that are no longer serving us. My hope also for this conversation is to bring a lot of different perspectives of the humans on this panel to talk about like what healing means for them, and also to make healing, and I think that this has been said beautifully before in this panel, make healing the central point. As a BIPOC community member and as a mental health therapist, really learning a lot about healing, but also applying that healing to ourselves. And how do we make sure that healing is accessible to all of the humans that live here? And I think accessibility is one of the huge pieces that we're missing out on. And when we're able to heal ourselves and heal each other, then we get to move towards liberation. And then those structures that don't serve us don't have power anymore. And I guess that's like one of my hopes.
Thank you. So Dwaine, I know you don't live in Central Oregon, but I'm going to ask you, because you just mentioned the 73 million versus the 80 million. What is your hope as we move into a post-Trump presidency? What is your hope for us as people of color?
So thank you very much for asking, Erika. Again, I was privileged to be able to teach first-year students, and I just finished teaching my first-year Introduction to Sociology class last week. And my hope is, as I've watched these young people sort of arrive on our campus, looking thirsty for knowledge, and I know this time we were in the Zoom format, but it happens every time to me as I watch them sort of move forward and have a sense that the future for them is still open. And my hope is really with them. And that is, they tend to arrive as people who have less inhibitions around LGBTQ issues. They have less inhibitions about interacting with people of color or just interacting with people in general. And I think that contrasts my own generation, who, when we arrived on campus, there was silos built up right away and people had a hard time sort of jumping through them. And so my hope for the future then is, despite the fact that we went through 4 years of someone intentionally using social media to intentionally create difference, to create silos, to create an us versus them, to perpetuate this notion that we have nothing similar to our fellow human being. I'm hoping that again, in the next cycle, which is the next 4 years, we will start rebuilding some of those bridges and continue moving forward. I mean, in my mind, we had 8 years of moving forward prior to Trump showing up, and now we have to work through that swirl. And the swirl itself is all encompassing for many of us, and we get swirled into it and we don't realize that history is actually repeating itself. These are not things that he invented himself, not far from it. He just used his ability to use social media to exacerbate some of those differences and make them, make them seem much more relevant than they really were. And so I'm looking forward to the United States of the future, and that's the future of a country that promises to have equal opportunity for all, or at least windows that we can actually climb through for some of us, and ladders and doors that we can actually break down and actually get to have a society that sort of reflects the good in the United States. And one example of that I'll give right now is the example of, if you looked at the folks who actually developed the coronavirus vaccine, one of the things that was very evident, if you just looked at them as a group of people, they virtually all were first or second generation immigrants. They virtually all were people of color, and they virtually all assisted, in a sense, to figure out, to crack this puzzle of how do we come up with a vaccine in a warp speed. And so I'm just suggesting to you that is really the future for the United States, is really to harness its second, third generation of people who arrive here initially as immigrants, immigrant families, and within a very short amount of time, they are contributing to the society in ways that are not like what we heard from the rhetoric from the Trump swirl, which is they're all a bunch of users and abusers. That's my hope.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is a question. Normally I prepare the panel for questions that I'm going to ask in advance, but this is a surprise question. And that question, if you choose to share, is how have you experienced bullying online, social media calling out, or attempts to cancel you, if you are willing to share? And how do those attempts or attacks make you feel as an individual and about the work that you do? So to give you some time, I'll go first and answer my own question. I often wonder, what in the world did I do to you? Often, these are people that have never met me one-on-one, and they are making judgments based off of an article they might read in the paper, or seeing my picture somewhere, or my name on the OSU-Cascades website, not knowing me as an individual. I'm a single mother of 2 children. I didn't get my bachelor's degree until I was 40 years old. I'm divorced. Those are things that people don't know. And not unless you're close to me or have sat down with me to have conversation, you don't know those things about me. I'm a human being, just like everybody else. I have worked very hard to reach where I am right now. There have been times in my life that I was robbing Peter to pay Paul, not literally robbing anybody. I want to make that very clear, but it's just an expression. But I mean, I didn't know how I would pay the light bill. I can relate to so many people on so many different levels. And I wish that more people would take an opportunity to get to know Erika, the person, and see beyond Erika, the professor, Erika, the director of XYZ, Erika, the woman of the year. You know, I almost cringe now when I hear that Erika was the woman of the year, because people use that and shape it as a dagger and throw it at me to hurt me. I can't say that the criticism hurts. I use it as opportunities to build upon and create space for other people to use their voices. But one thing I will say definitely is criticism will not make me stop. Canceling me is out of the question. It's just not happening. So, how does it make others feel?
I will go next if that's okay. And I just want to say, I am so proud that you got to be Women of the Year, because I know the community, right, that usually works in those environments and that makes those choices. And the achievement, right, that door you open, right, is now making it easier for the rest of us to be seen and recognized for the value of our work. So thank you for that. Going to the question of how I have experienced criticism, or I guess I want to distinguish between constructive criticism and just like interactions that are not meant to be constructive, right? Because those are part of living here in the community. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little nervous, right? Because this is intimate. The truth is that, you know, it's hard to connect with people when you don't know them and when you don't know the scope of their work, right? So many times, because I work behind the scenes, my work gets misinterpreted or gets shined in a different light. And so
We can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. So I also see the value of holding our leaders accountable, right? And having those important dialogues. So I strive to be transparent, and I have a body of work that I'm very proud of. So at the end of the day, like, that's what I rest on, right? I fix my own crown. I know where I come from. I know how hard I have worked for everything that I have made available for myself and for my community. And I continue to do that. So that's really what feeds me and what keeps me going. And there's opportunity to learn too. You know, at times, I know I don't have a perspective that includes all. Once I was reading a book called Waking Up White that was given as part of a equity, diversity, and inclusion training. And my daughter just looked at the cover, threw it on the bed, and said, "Mom, you're never waking up white." So it was clear to me that I'm never going to have that experience and that perspective. And so sometimes I'm asked, right, to word things and say things in a way that is palatable and digestible. But, you know, even with that, I understand that it is to bring people along, for people to better understand where I'm coming from. And, you know, maybe things have many layers and I'm 10 layers deep and folks are just scratching the surface. So I see that as a positive, right? But when you go into insulting, you know, there's no really value on that other than hurt the movement. All that does is it hurts the movement. It hurts all of us as community.
Thank you for sharing, Joanne. Would anyone else care to share?
I'll share. You know, when you ask that question, like, has anybody ever, you know, experienced just that feeling of being criticized, being bullied and such? And I think as I hear that question, I'm like, man, most of my life by most people. And as it relates to the professional world and, like, you know, as a mental health professional and like doing the work that I'm doing, oftentimes I have to watch and hear how I'm doing it. Am I doing it the right way? Am I not doing it the right way? Am I missing blind spots? Am I being taken advantage of? Because the spaces that I work in is predominantly white. And so there's moments like that. And so, and then the spaces that I work with that are within the community, there's conflict, right? There's dissension and there's division in that. And because once again, it's me showing up different, me showing up as myself, and everything that encompasses who I am and how I do the work that I do is always going to either rub up against someone or it's going to make someone happy and joyful about it, right? And so I think when I think about this, there's a project that I am a part of right now with several ladies on this panel that I love working with and super excited. And I think in some of the conversations that we have also had when we talk about diverse ways of doing this work, and where it starts to become, you know, there starts to become tension, right? In relationship, because there's conflict and tension in any relationship that you have. I'm now asking myself, and I'm going to name this. I know that I'm experiencing grief. I think a lot of people are experiencing grief, obviously, in 2020 because of everything that we've gone through. I do believe that people of color have experienced grief for many, many years, centuries. We have just been in this place of grief for a long time. And grief is not linear. It looks many different ways and has different shapes and sizes. And as a people of color, one thing that is often talked about is our resiliency and our ability to work and to resource and to gather together and to fight. I think as people of color, we're probably in this, we're constantly in the state of fight or flight. I believe that's what we are. That's what trauma has done to our bodies and to our psyches. And with that, I can't help but notice that come into play even when there's dissension and there's bullying, right? When I hear, some of you guys experiencing it and how that impacts you, when I think about how that impacts myself, there are some conversations that I've had that I've left the conversation feeling like I can't even be mad at this person right now because I know where it comes from. And where it comes from is that we are a community of people that are constantly fighting for resources and to be seen and to be heard. And when we do that, unfortunately, we will do that. It will leak onto each other because we have been taught to do that. Like Dwaine, you mentioned that earlier, and Erika, you mentioned it earlier, that when we think about slavery, when we think about the master, and we think about slave owners, right? And we think about house slaves, field slaves, and that kind of stuff, and the division and divisiveness that was created in order for control. We have been conditioned to operate in that way, and we don't even know it because we're so far removed from the awareness and the reality of it. And so for me, I experienced the bullying. I experienced the feeling like not good enough, feeling like I'm not doing this work well enough. I think sometimes I've even said, oh my gosh, like I have to not only, I don't have to just only respond to like my white counterparts in terms of how I do the work, but now I have to respond and deal with the woke police, right? And how the BIPOC community feels about the way that I do the work. I mean, it's double whammy for us. And I think we all experience that. How I'm dealing with it is I'm grieving. And I'm grieving because I'm constantly being reminded. This thought that comes in my head is, oh my gosh, they don't know what they don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And this is just the effects of trauma from generation to generation. And it's trickled down. And my desire is to continue to have compassion to the community. At the same time, it's painful and it's harmful. So I guess this again adds another layer of my hope is how can we sit in our grief and acknowledge the awareness around this and how deep this is, while also coming together and saying, we cannot do this to one another anymore. It's hurting us. Can both of those things be true?
Thank you, Judith. And I certainly hope that both of those things can be true. I certainly hope that we can stop doing this. I hope that we can. Anyone else before we move to questions from the audience?
So Erika, I might just want to comment on my academic trajectory as a person who came through the academy to eventually get onto a PhD. And as I think through that process, it was a lot of doors that had to open at certain times, a lot of opportunities had to sort of come at certain times. And I also want to reflect back on teachers or just people who come into my life in that time. And again, as a person of color, we oftentimes have people come into our lives who take away our confidence. And so that is often done in very subtle ways. It's done oftentimes through the tropes that they might have about us, the ways in which they regard us in terms of our work and where that work came from. It might also come in the form of them putting trauma on us for proving ourselves to be consistently in the world of academia and actually legitimately there, not there as a result of an affirmative action or some other reason that we got there, but they had to work hard to get to where they've gotten. And so those tropes and those ideas are clearly always among us and in the back of some people's heads that oftentimes are thrown out for us to have to be able to overcome the imposter syndrome. And so the imposter syndrome is that syndrome that often happens to people of color, whereby they've had a whole lifetime of people taking away things from them, diminishing them, subjecting them to microaggressions in all kinds of subtle ways, that over time that wears on you. And it really is another form of bullying, as you're talking about, Erika, that goes deep into the psyche of an individual. And it's one of those situations that you always have to sort of dust yourself off as you leave your front door and be able to put yourself together to be able to jump into your car, get to work, do your job, and then return home to then be able to shut your door and let your hair down, in a sense, figuratively and metaphorically. And so I want to just put that out there as yet another form of bullying that certainly people of color face, in addition to the regular day-to-day stuff that we oftentimes have to face from our own friends and colleagues who are also people of color, who are also maybe subjecting us to some of that stuff about horizontal hostility towards us, about you're only getting certain places because you are sucking up, or you're kissing up, or you are currying favor with the dominant group. That's how you're actually moving ahead of me, because that's the only way you can do it. So those kind of things are certainly there also for us to think about.
Thank you, Dwaine. Jessica?
Yeah, so the question really around how this has happened to us individually, and how do we deal with that? I think the way that I've seen it in this community is so different than where I'm used to. I came from a big city, and so I moved only here 2 years ago, and so seeing the way that it's here, it works here is just so visceral in a way that it requires, I think, action and conversations like this. And I think in big cities, in ways it can be hidden. And so I guess in a way, I'm grateful that we can have this kind of conversation. And so I'm here for that. And then I think too, when this has happened to me, I feel very much kind of what Joanne was saying, in terms of people don't know the body of work that I bring. And so it often gets dismissed, ignored. And when I try to voice it in certain ways, which is usually coming from a place of humanity, humility, and compassion always, it's just dismissed as woo, or kumbaya, or just these ways that are really, really dismissive of this work that's so important of healing our BIPOC community. And so the way that it makes me feel initially is just sad and grief, and I cry for days probably after an interaction like that happens. I call my support group and I cry some more, and then I journal and I do my whole grieving situation, and then kind of like Dwaine was saying, you dust yourself off and you go back. And there's this prayer that I wrote a book of poetry about, that is called "I'll Do the Labor if it sets my sisters free." And so it's sort of that mentality of yes, this is the body of work that I do, this is what I bring, and I'm going to keep doing it. And with the hope that that we can shine a light on liberation for all. And so I think that resiliency, I don't wear it as a badge of honor, but almost it's a responsibility, to be able to, or to have to, in a way, dust yourself off and go do it. And just going back to the hope that we can do this, we can begin to start this dialogue of centering healing for our small community. And if we can do it here, then just hope that fractals and what that can look like for collective liberation. And then also just wanting to point out this huge part of compassion for all the times that I've seen this happen to other people and happen to me sometimes, even though I tend to stay out of the fray because I don't want it to happen to me over and over. But just this idea that there's a reality that we live in for organizers, and it's not new. And that, the people that are in the vanguard of organizing work are not tending their inner fire. They're just on fire all the time. And so having compassion for that, and also knowing that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a movement called Healing Justice. And Healing Justice was founded in the 2000s by a Black queer woman in the South, around this exact thing, which is the burnout of organizing and the way that generational trauma wears on our bodies, our hearts, our soul, our DNA, and how we can continue to pass that on to for generations. And so this is something that is fairly new in terms of organizing, but it's been around for 20 years. And there are solutions, and there's people working in this movement. And I'm really excited to see Oregon, Central Oregon specifically, getting on board with that. And just one more thing is that I do see the fight. I do see the crabs in the bucket. I do see that happening, and it seems like it's almost impossible to interject or interrupt that harm. Or it doesn't, I don't see how to do it. I don't have like a manual of like, how do we do this? And when I do it, like I often don't do it correctly because I'm just trying in the moment to interrupt the harm that I see happening. And then with like the knowledge that like, 1% of venture capitalist funding to go to Black women in like the entire industry. And we're fighting, not me, I'm not a Black woman, but like that shows that, like this is like a small resource that these crumbs that we're fighting over. Less than 3% of philanthropy funding go to women of color. And so thinking about all of these tiny pieces and these tiny crumbs that we have to fight over, it also makes me want to like blow the like kind of zoom out in the picture and say like, how do we collectively bring more to our people? We don't need to fight for 1%. We don't need to fight for 3%. We deserve a whole lot more. And if we work together, maybe we can get it.
Thank you so much. So we do need to spend some time answering questions from the audience. So Nathan, you have anything for us?
Oh, a lot, and they're coming in. So I think everybody, again, I'm just going to express on behalf of everybody that's thrown in for chat right now, the level of vulnerability and the ability for you to share your voices so effectively for this presentation tonight is definitely being seen throughout the participants. So I just want to echo again, as kind of a co-moderator for the question side, I just appreciate your time, your energies, and your passion in being able to help bring these topics to light. I think it's clearly, as we're seeing coming through, very effective for folks and very moving. So kind of having said that, the voice piece is a massive piece. And how do we provide that voice? How do we provide that strength so somebody can share their story? First question coming in is, some of you have mentioned like the layers of identity that sometimes impact the ability to bring things forward. How does the community engage families that are high stressed or poverty? So kind of one of the social identity pieces, to have a voice, because as we've expressed, that's difficult for most people. I would say you all are exceptional being able to share that with everybody, but how do you help stressed and poverty influence folks have that voice for what they need?
I'll jump in. I really appreciate the work of Equity in the Center, ran by Karen Suarez. I had the privilege of attending one of the workshops this past year where they talk about solidarity among BIPOC communities. So I think the question was a little bit twofold. First, how do we create solidarity? And then how do we open the space to uplift those voices, right? So to create solidarity, we really need to understand our histories and be able to analyze how each individual group is positioned around different issues like policing, immigration, healthcare, housing, right? We cannot be in this struggle of oppression, Olympics, and who is more oppressed than the other, but rather understanding. And I didn't have the words to be able to explain this before, but really, in order for communities of color to find solidarity among each other, we need to understand who is vulnerable within our community and find those intersectional threads with other communities, right? And how do we make space for our communities? I love Ali Henny and her explanation of what an ally does, right? Always center the impacted, leverage your privilege, yield the floor. And so I think that it's important, right, that we invest on giving people of color their own space for us to have our own conversations, our own healing, our own, leadership building. I know that a lot of folks within the white community are really interested in building bridges and connecting. And we will get there, and we are working on it every day. But we also need spaces to build ourselves, to heal our own communities, to have conversations about how, the history we have that is shared has impacted us individually as groups, right? So that when we come in partnership with the Anglo community and with other communities, we come as equals. We come healed, we come whole, and we come ready to play, right?
I think that was perfect.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Would anybody else like to comment, or could go move on to the next question? I was like, great answer. Nicely done. This will be kind of a two-parter, and I think Dwaine, we'll talk with you first on this one. Question coming in through YouTube from Amber. So question is, so I'm curious about how Dr. Plaza sees difference and / overlap between cancel culture and setting boundaries.
Okay, so thank you, Amber, for the question. Setting boundaries, again, I'm of a belief that we need to have some serious conversations about allowing for racist, sexist, homophobic, classist kind of language in any space, not just the media space of the internet. So with that in mind, I think I'm not arguing for the regulation of social media, but I think we do have to have some sort of societal norms and mores about what is acceptable in those areas. I haven't worked out in my head yet how that would actually take place, but I do definitely believe that nobody, including myself, should have a bullhorn to be able to be racist, sexist, homophobic, classist in terms of my language or in my denigration of other groups. And that's what, in my mind, the social media platforms have created a venue where there are no boundaries. In other words, anybody from the smallest person in let's say, living on an island somewhere, as long as they have an internet connection, can actually have that access to the entire world. Recall I showed you there's 3 billion people who are actually on social media. That to me is problematic because once again, we've got, lots of individuals who are on those various social media sites who potentially are being influenced by that one person who lives on that one island, their racist, sexist, or homophobic views. So it really is we're in a interesting place in history where we need to have more dialogue about those sorts of situations and how we as a society and a culture come to terms with those abilities for people to have those bullhorns in a sense, and I go even further than bullhorns, loudspeakers, to voice their hatred and their disgust with different groups that are not like themselves. So it's a tough place to be.
Thank you for that. And I think then to the rest of the panel, kind of taking off from that, this question comes in through Minty. Are there any suggestions that you all have seen effective into de-escalating some of the tensions being felt in Bend currently among different groups that many of which you all have alluded to in one form or fashion this evening?
My suggestion would be talk to each other. Instead of allowing this unknown, I guess, wound, because I'm in the belief, like with Judith, that it comes from a place of hurt or anger about some type of injustice that has been done, right? Maybe I wasn't the person selected to do this, and why were they? Or why are they getting this feature in the paper and we aren't? That type of feeling of being wronged is probably what creates this wound within people to feel like they have to talk about it in the first place. And so talking to who you feel wronged you might be one way. But again, I am not a mental health professional, and I will say that 1,000 times. My way of dealing with things is to work alone. And that may not be the best way of dealing with it, but trusting people, I was listening when Joanne was talking about having spaces where people of color can heal on their own. And immediately I felt tension in my body because many of the most painful experiences in my life have come from people of color. And so it's a safety issue for me of not knowing if I'll feel safe in that kind of environment. So, but I'm all for talking to people that feel like I've wronged them in some way to try to come to some understanding. People on this panel can tell you, I'll apologize if I know I've hurt you, but if I don't know, there's nothing I can do about that, And so I think bringing the concern forward to the person that you feel like caused you harm is the first place to start. And feel free, anybody else, to speak up.
I mean, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Jess. When we think about like de-escalating, it's usually something outside of like the current conflict that's happening. There's something within ourselves or there's something in the background. And so when we talk about anti-racism work, we talk about like you're doing the work in relation with people, but you're also doing your own personal work. Like what is happening inside of yourself that needs additional support? And are you seeking people that support you? It's so incredibly important in a time that is so high tension, and there's so much of BIPOC community members being on the front of everything, doing all of this work for so many different people in this community, that we have spaces and we have places to kind of do our own work and have people who we love and trust to support us. The tension piece is important because we're thinking about some end result, but that's also skipping the entire process. That's skipping the entire journey. In the moment prior to the tension, in the moment prior to the conflict, we need to be able to have spaces to heal. When we kind of skip past that and kind of go to the focal point of like tension or go to the focal point of conflict, then we're not really giving space for ourselves to kind of be supported. And initially, if you're not receiving the support that you need and you don't have a structure for that, and you're a BIPOC community member, I mean, that's white supremacy right there.
Yeah, I that point at the end, Rita, I think is so important. I'm a little bit nervous about this conversation, and I told everybody on like our initial call, like, oh, I'm just so nervous because I know that a lot of the folks that support this work and a lot of the folks that are going to be like listening to this work are going to be like white allies, and like what's it going to feel like and look like to be like, hey, like we got problems in the BIPOC community, check us out. But it's not like that. That's not what the purpose of this is, but that's a little bit of anxiety that comes up. And so just like as like something that I think allies can do, like this space isn't for you to have really like an opinion on like, oh, this brown person is wrong and this brown person is right. Like that's not your space, right? And so like the space and like the role that I see allies in this work is like white people make way, like make space, make way, invest in all of us. Don't choose your favorite, right? And like the one person you agree with, like how can you spread resources? How can you redistribute? How can y'all organize in a way that lifts us all up so that we're not fighting for 1%? So we're not fighting for 3%, so that we can all feel taken care of and resourced and like we don't have to fight each other. So that's like big picture. That's not like really in the moment, but I guess in the moment too, I teach a class on tomorrow night, and it's free. It's called Love, Rage, and Nonviolence. And it's an hour-long meditation class, and it talks about how we tend our anger and how we use nonviolence, like the teachings of Dr. King, to interrupt violence, and how do we do it from a place of love. And so I'm not going to get into that right now, but y'all can check out that free class tomorrow.
All All right, thank you all very much. I'm going to take a couple of these questions and I guess kind of morph them as best as I can, because you just sort of alluded to it, is the divide that exists, the racial divide that exists, and I think whether you want to call it politically within our communities, whatever that might look like. Are there ways in which, and examples here are, how do we like sit down in a meeting with quote unquote white supremacy leaders in our community? How do we sit down with folks that have such a very different view of the world? How do we sit down with the reference in one of these questions was around, we've had lots of different movements happening in the last couple months in Bend. I guess we just had a weekend by supporters of the current president. How do we sit down and have that conversation with groups where I think they become very, very polarized? But we've talked a lot about healing tonight. We've talked a lot about those conversations. How does that happen?
I want to jump on that one there, Nathan, just because some of us don't. So when you say, how do we, you have to clarify who this we is, right? And I think we also need to talk about the different dialogues that we need to have within our Central Oregon community. So in this particular example, we are talking about a very polarized group, right? Folks that are white supremacists, that have very strong views on race, and that many times can be harmful in their speaking, in their actions. So, do I want to sit down at a table with them? No, not right now. That is not my role. But I have allies that have done the work and that are ready to talk to their own community about the problems of white supremacy and how it's showing up in their community and that harm that causes not only to them, but to all of us. I think my role, or not necessarily my role, but my aspiration, what I hope to do, is to also have conversations within my own community about how we also have been indoctrinated through colonization to uphold values of white supremacy, and how those are impacting us, and how those are causing barriers for us to come into solidarity with other groups, right? So yes, we all need to have conversations, but these are different conversations in different spaces with the same goal of bringing and creating a culture of equity, of equality for all, right? So I hope I was not a Grinch on that one, right? It's not that we don't want to build bridges, yes, but we're not going to build it on our blood at our expense for the betterment of a group, right? We're going to do this with healing justice. We're going to do this in a manner that builds us and builds you and builds all of us together.
I want to echo what Joanne just said and just use another analogy for some of us to also think about, and that is male violence in our culture. And so that's not the work of women to have to do that. That's the work of men having to work with other men to actually start dismantling that culture in our society. And so women can clearly have conversations with sons and people they're helping to bring up. But when we talk about the structural issue of systemic violence that actually permeates our superstructure, that's the work of men having to take that on with other men. And similarly, what Joanne just said about white supremacy, yeah, that is really the role of white Euro-American folks to take on those groups and work with them to try to get them to a better ideological understanding of the history behind white supremacy. And it is a socially constructed notion of white supremacy that needs to be dismantled through understanding of histories, anthropologies, societies, and histories. And how do you actually go about doing that? Is through education. So thank you, Joanne, for putting that out there. I agree with you 100%.
So I'm a bit different in that I will have those conversations. I will try to build bridges, and I think that we can do more than one thing at a time. I think that we can focus on healing, but also work to build bridges across cultures. So I am willing to have those conversations. And I think that maybe I'm a bit of a empathetic person, sometimes overly so, to the point that we say white supremacy, but I've had people that were raised in racist households sit down after one of my trainings and sit down with me and cry because they just realized that they grew up in a racist household and they weren't aware of how growing up impacted who they are today. And so it's sort of going back to, we can't fault people for what they don't know. And I'm willing to provide education across the board, not just to my own people, but to other people as well.
So Eric, I don't think anybody's arguing with that. I took it as the folks who are the hardline white supremacists, and that's a group, again, I don't think I would ever, no matter how much teaching I do, and as you introduced me, I actually teach race nothing relations. So I actually get a whole, for 10 weeks, I get a chance to interact with people that go from all ranges of consciousness about race and ethnicity. And so, yes, there is a self-selection bias built into someone who even chooses to be in a class with me, meaning that they're choosing to take a class like this. But at the same time, some of them come with, of course, deep entrenched ideas, and others come with ideas that they've inherited through socialization that are coming back to this whole notion of white fragility. In other words, they don't really press the issue. They think they're allies, but the reality is that they have done and continue to do very paternalistic, very racist, very sexist, very homophobic things, and they don't even realize it. So that's the group I can work with. I can work with that group quite easily, and I can help them move along and raise their consciousness. It's the other group that I'm referring to, and maybe Joanne's referring to the other group too, which is that group that's the far extreme right, the gun carrying, the flag waving. That's a different kind of group for me, and I have a harder time working with that group. And I think that's a group that I don't aspire to ever work with. And again, we're just different, Erica, and there's definitely just different perspectives.
I just want to clarify too, because the mission of the organization I work with is building bridges. So I do work on building bridges with all different communities, but again, looking for that allyship piece, right? I am a single mom, with 2 children that I care for, and I'm the sole provider. I have, underlying health conditions that cause disability. So I have to be very mindful of what spaces I put myself in. So I most definitely work towards allyship and under what allyship really is. But again, certain groups, that's just much more than that I have the capacity for. And that's why I hope to have allies that I can tap on and say, hey, this is a troublesome experience or a troublesome interaction. Have my back, please, reach out to your fellow community member and help me carry the work of anti-racism. Because it's a relay, this is a relay race, because this is a movement. We're all working towards the same goal. So I have to be able to pass the baton when I know this is not a safe environment for me.
I love when you say that, Joanne, just being able to pass the baton when you know this is not a safe environment, or not even just that. For me, it's when I know this is not a safe environment for me, and also when I know that that's not within my capacity, right? That's not within my area of wanting to work with a specific group. So I think that's so important. It's so interesting because when I think about, I work predominantly in the transracial adoption community, and I'm working with parents who are, when we think about transracial adoption, the percentage of it is white parents who are adopting kids of color, whether it's internationally or domestic, or in the States. And so And it's so interesting to me because the greatest way for me to see what's going on in our culture today is like for me to look at history. And not only just look at history, but also look at what our kids, look what's going on within the youth. How are they making sense to the world around them and such, especially this year? And so in the transracial adoption community, I love working with that community. The reason being is because there's an interracial relationship that has already happened. You have parents that love their kids. And I know there's a conversation we talk about where love is not enough, right? To be anti-racist, love is not enough. And what does that even mean when you say you love someone, right? In some ways. And so with a lot of the education and just the work that I do in regards to understanding racism, even in the child welfare system, because it was created, unfortunately, if we're thinking about white supremacy, and that's the term that we're using, it was created within that foundation in the child welfare system. And so, but I'm working with parents and families who love their children, they care about their kids, but have no understanding of the community, the culture that's connected with those children, and understanding of their own bias and the harm that they perpetuate even on the kids that they have taken into their home. And so like Erika, when she talks about sitting down with an individual who starts to cry and who's just like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this. So many times I'm often sitting down with parents who have adopted Black and brown kids who are struggling and who feel the same exact way. I didn't realize that I contributed to this very same thing. And then a lot of times, some of the parents don't even want to go there and look at that because that is creating a whole lot of shame for them. The other term for shame is white fragility that we hear. And so it's a lot. And so when I'm working with kids, I remember, and I'll just share this quick story because it just reminds me of what we're talking about in a lot of ways, but there are two clients, without trying to share too much information, two clients of color that I am working with. One who is adopted and lives in a white home, white environment. The other one is not, has, parents of color and live in a more diverse area and went to school in a very diverse place where they didn't even see white people in their school. And I'm watching these two individuals who are so close, who have a tight relationship, even struggle in the way that they address racism in the community that they're in. And they battle even within that. And the common theme is feeling lonely in the work that they're doing, even if they do it differently. So I'm watching youth and teenagers have the same conversations that I feel like I have in these spaces all the time with BIPOC professionals, colleagues of mine, and even in this space right now, where we have our youth struggling with that and trying to make sense of that. Why is that person less aggressive in addressing racism when I'm more aggressive with it and I feel alone with that? I have youth who are of color explaining to each other, you don't understand how I feel because your economic status is different from mine. You don't experience poverty in the same way that I've experienced poverty. I have youth who are who are struggling to understand from another BIPOC friend or youth, right? How come it's hard for you to name how you're feeling in this or to address a situation with a white peer, with a white friend of ours, when I have to do that and I feel alone doing that in this way? Does that make sense? So I oftentimes see it in the youth, and coming away from that, I am more challenged to say conversation is so important. Us talking about and making space for the multiple ways that we are doing this work and how we're doing this work, and allowing that to be that, and remembering that the reasons why we show up to do the work that we do in the way that we do it, even in professional spaces, has a lot to do with our upbringing. Because I saw it with my kids, like it has a lot to do with our upbringing and what we're so used to in that way. And so like I know Erika enough to know the reason to why she operates and do the work that she does in that way. I know Jessica enough, the reason to know why she operates and does her work the way that she does it. And so I think that having more conversations and more compassion and understanding that our lived experiences in this world definitely influences the way we do this work has a big part of it. And how can we hold that to be true while also obviously going towards the same direction? I think education, like Erika, like you said, education can go simultaneously with what you're saying, Joanne, is we have to heal our people so we can come whole into these relationships, whether they're ally relationships or other communities that we're bridging. Both of it happens simultaneously. Enough time to like have deeper analysis and deeper awareness of why our trauma is there, why was it created, why do I operate and show up the way that I do. At the same time, there is those action steps where you have the education, the workshops, the trainings, the sitting with allies and walking them through the process. I think all of it has to be what it is. I'm a Christian woman, and as a Christian woman, I often think about the terminology that we use within this space is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ operates in different, they all have different jobs, and all these jobs are happening at the same time simultaneously. And that brings together this wholeness. That's why it's a body. We're bringing together this people of color bodies, and we're operating in these different ways, and we come together simultaneously in it, and it becomes a beautiful work of liberation and a reconciliation and of healing. And so oftentimes I just use my spirituality to really lean into understanding the idea of diversity and making space for that, and understanding the body as well too. But yeah, that's it.
No, thank you for that. The couple of the questions that are coming in, and I'm going to single it down to education, but a lot of comments coming in for what you've kind of addressed, and I know that we addressed in the last event that we did a couple months ago, but around white allyship and what do we need to do. And I will simply say what I took from that last event and what I've kind of learned over my own process of honestly being one of those kids that grew up in Central Oregon that just didn't know yet and has had his own path. So I think the things that I learned is speak up, step up. Don't wait for somebody to tell you as a white ally what you should be doing. You need to go figure that out. Dwaine talked a lot about history, learning history, and that's actually what I'm going to hit in a second. Know the history, understand the history. And a question came in about from like CEOs and presidents of companies, what do you do to get this? Put your money where your value is. If you're going to say that DEI is important to you, you better be investing in your people on it. So that's like some things that I think I heard from the last one that I, as a white ally, I'd like to just answer if that's okay. But I want to go to a specific around this education piece that we've talked about, learning the history, whatever that may look like. I'm wondering, Jessica, if maybe you can kind of start with this. What do you think things need to change in our own education system that would kind of help move messages forward and better understand and maybe get more of a complex look at what we used to know as our history?
You asking me, Jessica, about the education system? Okay, I don't know if I'm like the right person to do that. I've been through an education system. I have an advanced degree, but like in terms of like education policy, like that's not really my forte. I mean, I'm happy to talk on it, but I feel like there's other people in this group that may be able to like do that better than me.
That's fine. I was just going to popcorn a couple people that happen to like education as a theme and kind of what they talked about tonight. So,
well, I mean, before I pass the mic, though, I do want to say like what you did say about like in terms of like what allies can do in terms of in investing. But like, I just need to stress, it's not like investing like, $500 or like $1,000. Like you need to invest us like you want us to win. Mm-hmm. You need to really think about what it takes to build a movement and think about that amount of money and build that and then bring it to us. Because we can't survive on 1%. We can't build on 1%. We need big money. We need big support, big like belief and trust to build these movements. And so really thinking about like, this isn't like, oh, I'm gonna, give $50 to like my favorite Black and brown organizers in town for Christmas. No, this is like, how can you organize, use your privilege, leverage that to come together and really think about how you can support us and encourage, and not just like the people that are in this panel, but like there are organizers all over Central Oregon that need to be lifted up and supported and to the place where that we can thrive. And so, I mean, I work in philanthropy and I didn't really mention that up until now, but it's like, we need to be funded like you want us to win. And so like, that's the big thing. And there's obviously other things that allies can do, but in terms of like redistributing like wealth in order to close the health gap, close the wealth gap. Like that's what we're talking about in terms of like long view of liberation and sovereignty and empowerment. So I pass the education piece on to the educators.
Dwaine, do you want to take that one then?
Yeah, sure, I will, Nathan. Thank you very much for asking that question. It's an age-old question that continues to occur in the public school system and the high school system, and that is, why don't teachers have the freedom to teach critical history theory, critical history in terms of history that's beyond just the winners? And I always like to think about history being taught from the perspective of only the winners. We rarely know what happens to those folks who were the losers in history, and that is women, people of color, Native American people, low-income people. We know all about the wealthy people, and we know all about what the men did in history. And so this is oftentimes a forgotten history only because we teach history in a certain way, and that way is oftentimes top-down. So as a result of that, you have young African-American students or young Latino students or young Native American students coming through the Oregon public school system. And by the time they arrive to my class, for example, and I start teaching about history from the periphery, it's all new to them. And it's all new primarily because their teachers and their previous schools, that was curriculum that was not allowed to be taught. So some teachers, of course, who teach history know that history exists in the Oregon public schools, but they realize really early on that their superintendent, their principal or their vice principal, once they hear they're doing this kind of a pedagogical scholarship with their students, shut them down right away. They say they don't want any complaints from parents. Parents are too sensitive, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to get to that point. And you know, one of the things I do always celebrate too is the whole notion of social media in this perspective. When I say that, I'm talking about YouTube. I'm talking about you know, those videos that are made out there, vlogs and so forth, that people are actually creating and then putting them up online. And they oftentimes have an alternative reading of history. And so to me, some of that learning is going on, and we have to celebrate that too, because it's sort of rebel history that's taking place, where students, young people, are actually being exposed to this. And so some of my students will arrive in my classes woke. They know, they are so far advanced compared to some other students who come from very conservative backgrounds, where their schools were designed to only teach a certain curriculum to them that really creates a really narrow perspective. And so it's no surprise to me that some of those students, when they sit down in a class for me, they're going, wow, I never thought of that before. I didn't know that. You know, show me some more. And that's what I want to see, is that kind of situation where, again, policymakers, state legislators, et cetera, can start creating policy and creating legislation that actually requires a certain ethnic studies component. And we've recently passed that in the state of Oregon. I know we've passed that, but I want to see it actually implemented, so we actually have new textbooks and new ways of learning about this topic. So we're moving in that direction. I'm not saying we're not, but boy, it's been a snail's pace so far.
No, great comments. Thank you for that. Rita, kind of actually, go, Joanne, go for it, please. Yes.
If I could just add a little bit to that, you know, I see education extending outside of the context of academia. Why? Because I have parents, I have grandparents, I have cousins, I have my own community, right? When I see what we have learned from history repeating itself or from generational trauma, I think that we also have to acknowledge that we can unlearn those things, that we can learn new things. To me, this journey of learning new things and unlearning things that do not serve all of us are ongoing. I think that we are on a journey of shifting culture, of creating a culture that cares for all members of the community. And so this business of changing minds and hearts doesn't happen just in the school. It needs to happen in all facets of society. So education could be me talking to my parents, right? Education could be the city having messaging that incorporates inclusivity, that talks about equity and disparities for communities of color, right? So education is something that you can do this holiday season. Education is something that you should be doing ongoingly on your own self, right? Learning and unlearning, but also having these dialogues with your community, with your kids, with your neighbors, with your girlfriends, with, you know, in whatever circles you are. This work of education and racial and social justice doesn't take a day off. Racism doesn't take a day off, and shouldn't anti-racism, right?
Let me add one more point to Joanne's comment. We shouldn't be afraid of history. Yes, American history is an ugly history in many respects, but other histories are also ugly, and we teach those quite readily. There's this notion in the United States that if we don't teach it to people, they won't be bothered by it. So one of the ways in which slavery was actually maintained was by keeping slaves totally ignorant. Never teaching them to learn to read or write. Make sure if they're only going to read one thing, they're going to read the Bible, and that's it. And so I want you to think about that in the context of how do you keep a group down, is that you take their history, take all history away from them, take all aspects of learning, knowledge, and then only funnel your knowledge and only funnel your perspective to them. And this is what we often refer to as the sort of white supremacist narrative that a lot of people of color grew up with when they looked in their history books or their science books, or they were always only celebrating men's accomplishments, white American people accomplishments or white folks accomplishments. And there was rarely ever a notation or an acknowledgement that people of color ever had anything to do with anything good. It was always disasters. It was always, things that fell apart. And on the other side of that, of course, is the European glorified history of these advanced societies that were, and yet, if we really unpack it, we realize that Egyptian society, Chinese society, South Asian society, Greek society, these were all advanced societies. I mean, Europe was in the backwoods, up until the 13th, 14th century, when they finally got out of the dark, quote unquote, dark ages, right? But that history is kind of gone from people's minds, and it only connects with the advancements. So just keep that out there.
Can I give a little example? I know we probably need to move on to the next question, but I do want to give an example of something we did right here in Central Oregon. Right before COVID hit, we had the Central Oregon Women's March, right? And you think of a march as just, kind of having a presence, but we did 2 educational pieces that we added to it because, we are in the business of changing culture, of changing minds and hearts. So we had 2 exhibits along with the march, right? And the speakers and all of that. We had one exhibit that talked about Oregon's timeline of racist laws and how they have expanded from 1844, when we were just coming about statehood, all the way till nowadays. But we also had an exhibit of leaders that look like us, women and femmes of color that have held the resistance. And I think that is so important that when we talk about education, we talk about our history. Just as Wayne said, oh my goodness, there are pyramids. Our ancestors have knowledge of the cosmos. They were able to live in harmony with the earth, right? But still produce agriculture, have aqueducts. There's a richness of our own history that we need to learn.
Thank you very much. And kind of moving on with that too, and I'm going to put Rita on the spot. This is what I was going to do. Question came in around now our new councilor-elect for the city of Bend, and what are some ways in which your role can help us as a community kind of shift that this narrative or this need, this cultural shift to get us in a better place than we're coming out of?
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. I think it's important. And I guess I am the only city councilor-elect on this call, so I guess I should be the one to answer it. So I think, honestly, the first step was to get me elected, and y'all did that. So props to everyone on this call, and then also props to all of you out there. The second piece is that we don't stop with elections. We don't just stop with getting people in power that have the awareness and the lived experience to move these ideas forward. Then we continue to support them and we continue to bring ideas to them. I'm one human being with one perspective on how to bring equity into policy and really uplift a lot of people who have been oppressed for a really long time in this community, but I'm only one human. And so continuing to bring that feedback to me forward. It's also about deconstructing the things that aren't supporting anyone in this community. There's so many pieces here in Bend that make barriers for everyone who lives here, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's conversations about mental health accessibility, whether it's just getting anyone's basic needs met. And time again, we feel like these subjects are separate, that when we're talking about anti-racism and when we're talking about people's basic needs being met, that they're happening in these two separate vacuums, and that's not true. A lot of the times, the reasons why humans can't get their basic needs met are based in racist values. And so as we address those racist values and as we do our own work, we can then break down these racist structures that don't really serve anyone. And the reality is, and Jess talked about this a little bit earlier, is the wealth disparity in this town is insane. And so we really have to address that as an entire community. It can't just be a small group of us, and it can't just be from one perspective. It has to come from different perspectives. And it's really about having a conversation on, do you want this community to really move forward? Because moving this community forward is not just one fundraiser. It's not just one organization. It's us working as an entire community to move us forward. And not only is that happening, that needs to happen through capitalism, that needs to happen through anti-racism work. It's from all of those pieces, but we have to move forward as a community and break down those structures that really aren't serving anyone.
And as somebody in chat was saying, it's not one counselor-elect that can do everything. So we got your back. We got your back. Excellent. And so what I want to do is, Erika, I think we've hit, at least from chat, a number of the questions in addition to what was presented tonight. I guess the one to kind of leave with, because we've definitely hit the heartstrings of a lot of folks here, maybe going through similar stories with what was shared tonight. What are some suggestions that you all can give as panelists for members of the BIPOC community that are frontline activists, are educators, are people that are, kind of right there in the trenches doing this work? What are some ways that they can heal and feel safe after dealing with that day-to-day backlash that you all can, that you all were talking about? So I think some of you kind of hit it a little bit, but what are some suggestions for folks that are really struggling with that right now?
This is one that I'll give everybody a chance to get to answer. And knowing the path that some people are on, I just want to take this opportunity to say, know what works for you. I know what works for me in terms of what I need to do to ground myself, to I know my tribe, the people that I go to, that I need when I need my cup to be filled. Know who those folks are, and have people that will have your back in public just as much as they will have your back in private. If you can't have my back in public, please don't even. That's the way I feel about it. Loyalty and trust and having that group of people that you can rely on, for me, is super important. And often those people are the people that I collaborate with and do this work with when I feel safe, when I feel that I can be vulnerable in a space with people that support me and have my back. So know who they are, you know, and have mentors. I have many mentors from Alabama, where I'm from, mentors here at OSU. And I have a variety of mentors, not just, you know, people of color as well. So I think that knowing who those people are, calling on them when you need them, and retreating and going to a secret space when you need to do that is important, because this work is not going away. It will be here, and you can take a break from it and come back. Those are my thoughts.
If I were to think about the same issue, for me, a lot of this has to be giving grace to one another. And I say that intentionally because not only because of COVID, but just the institution itself can grind you up and actually make you into something that you're not. And I say that primarily because horizontal hostility is really easy to get to, and you don't realize you're doing it to a fellow person of color. If you start looking at that person through the eyes of the person who is part of the dominant group and only looking through those eyes, you have to obviously think that you got to the academia, or you got the institution through folks helping you out. So how can you take a ladder and stick it down behind you and say, hey, come on up this ladder, come on up this way, because I can help you out, because I've already gone through that in some kind of way. And using that as a strategy, giving more ladders than snakes, in a sense, that will really help all of us out to feel like we're in a place of safety. Because one of the things you will notice if you're in an institution like Oregon State University is there are very, 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 very few people that look like you anywhere on campus. And as a result of that, we need to help each other out. So I'll leave it off with that. Helping each other out, having grace with each other, and making sure that you're not looking through the eyes of the colonizer or the dominant group when you're judging people of color.
So yeah, I love that question and that last, that last piece. So with being wellness in the wellness field, I just really, I love and appreciate the multiple ways that we can take care of ourselves, take care of our bodies, take care of our minds, our souls, our spirits. I think that's so important. I love what Erika said in regards to know what works for you. Know what works for you. A couple of us and Jessica and Rita, you guys can say more to this as well too on your piece. But one thing that I wanted to uplift and kind of share to answer that question is, a few of us here in the Central Oregon area who are practitioners, whether it's we have chiropractic, yoga, meditation, mental health professionals. There's a wide range of people here. Practitioners who are BIPOC in the community that offer different services to meet the needs of a diverse group of people. And so we actually created and are in the process of officially creating we have a nonprofit that's called the Healing Justice Collective. It kind of speaks to what Jessica was talking about earlier in regards to healing justice and where it originated from. We created basically the same thing here. And the biggest mission of that is resourcing wellness as it relates to spirit and our minds, our bodies, etc. Resourcing those resources, resourcing those things to the community by also supporting the BIPOC practitioners. Oftentimes, as a mental health professional, I have a practice here and I serve the community, and sometimes the community based off of, we talk about economic status here and the economics of Central Oregon can't afford certain services. And then I have to scale my prices in order to meet the needs of the community. And then that impacts me as a BIPOC practitioner. And so a group of us decided that we needed to create some reparations around that and really call for people in the community to, if we're talking about allies, to put your money where it is, right? To support and help this project, this opportunity to resource these services to the community. So it's called the Healing Justice Collective, and it's a nonprofit. It is raising and fundraising money in order to resource mental health services or wellness services of all kinds in the community to the community in that way. And so that is one way to support and to help with that. I don't know, Jess, if you wanted to add some more to that information.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Yeah, there's a huge commitment here into like centering healing in this work, and one of the big things, as Judith said, is to offer these services for free or very low cost to BIPOC people in this community. And we've budgeted to help, or not help, but to offer over 2,500 services to BIPOC in 2021. We're really wanting to shift the paradigm of what wellness and access to wellness and health looks like here, because we envision a future where we're all able to access health. We're envisioning a future of like actual liberation, where we're not dreaming of labor and dreaming of organizing, but we're actually dreaming of being healthy and living in these bodies in a way that feels like non-oppressive. And so, yeah, and so this is like a really important project that we're well underway. And I just wanted to share just like a few thoughts again too about like how folks BIPOC can begin to, I mean, also like acknowledging like wherever anyone is with their decolonization path is like totally valid and okay. So many of us are just starting, just dipping in our toe, and every single place you are on this path is valid. And I just want, this is, okay, here comes in my like woo, and here comes in my like maybe corny like piece, but it's really authentic and it's really true. So I'm just gonna go for it. And that's like that every single Black and brown body in this community is sacred. And we hold so much wisdom in our ancestors and in our power. And like, it's so worth it. We are worth tending to, and you are, each and every one of you, worth tending your fire. You don't need to you don't need to be on like enraged and inflamed every single day, because you're worth tending. And we want to provide space for that. And even though it's so tempting to turn to like greed, it's really sharing that's going to save us. And when it's really tempting to turn to like our individualism, it's actually collective well-being that's going to save us. And it's really tempting to turn to denying what's in front of us, kind of what Judith was talking about earlier, not wanting to face us, but really the truth is what's going to save us all and lift us all up. And so I really implore you all to believe in us, to fund us like you want us to win, to fund us like you want us to heal, to continue to support the work that Erika and Nicole are putting forth in this panel, making space for like a public conversation about this when no one else has provided this. I know that OSU is also fundraising for their lab, and I'm sure that we'll talk about that later as well. But all of these opportunities are so important, and I feel it in like my wholeness that we're gonna get there. And even though it doesn't feel like it right at points when I'm like curling up in a ball and crying because like someone was mean to me or whatever, right? Like I believe in the long view of liberation. I believe that if we each can hand down that ladder, if we can each build on what our ancestors brought forward, like we're gonna get there as a community. And so there was my woo, but it's really true and authentic, so I just did it.
Jess, and I greatly appreciate that, and greatly appreciate everybody's insight. I'm looking down at the clock right now, and this is where I've got to be the bad guy and be like, oh no, we're at time. But that was a really quick 2 hours. So really good conversation, really good insight. Just on behalf of myself and for all of our participants, I'm going to let Erika kind of close this out. But a lot of great feedback from the commenters, a lot of questions I could not get to. I think you all hit the nail on the head for the topic tonight. It's just such powerful information, so important for our community. And I just want to again say, on behalf of my small moderation role for this, just want to thank you for your participation tonight. And Erika, I'll let you kind of close us out.
Thank you, Nathan. I just want to thank everyone for your participation in tonight's event. Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing so much with this community. Thank you for supporting me. I called on you, you answered, and I appreciate it very much. I want to thank Nathan, the production team, for their work behind the scenes and supporting this event tonight. And Dwaine, thank you. I cannot tell you the influence that you've had on my career since I met you just last year. So thank you for that. Also, I just want to share that Love Your Neighbor operates solely on donations. We pay our panelists for their emotional labor. And so in the slides after this, you will see how you can donate to Love Your Neighbor. And I had not planned on mentioning the Diversity Lab, but I will. OSU-Cascades Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Laboratory is now doing a fundraising effort, and the provost of Oregon State has agreed to match dollar for dollar donations that are given up to $15,000. So if you would like to donate to the DEI Lab, which supports the work that I do with organizations in Central Oregon, please reach out to me at erika.mccalpine@osucascades.edu, and I will make sure that you get pointed in the right direction to make that donation. Just know that this work is happening all over this community, it's happening all over this state, it's happening all over this country. Please, as Jessica was saying, support the same way you support businesses with your dollars, right? And I'm not gonna say don't give your money to the people that you like, because if you like me, please help me out. But I will say that supporting causes you believe in is important. And if there's not anything locally that appeals to you, then please search nationally for organizations and this work that is going forward to help advance communities of color. Thank you so much for supporting Love Your Neighbor. And as always, love your neighbor regardless of the skin they are in. Thank you so much for attending.